Hi, my name is Andy Lazur. I am a water quality specialist with the University of Maryland Extension, and I'd like to share with you some basic principles of groundwater, how to protect it, and stewardship practices that we can all employ to protect this valuable resource. I'm going to cover a few things in the next 20 minutes or so. Talk a bit about the water cycle, different types of aquifers, how groundwater can be contaminated, water wells, and then cover some stewardship practices. This is a schematic of the hydrologic or water cycle, which shows a basic fundamental physical practice that goes on continuously on Earth, and very important, shows the connectivity of all of our water. So water will evaporate from the land surface and from oceans, form clouds in the atmosphere. Then we have different types of precipitation, snow, ice, and then that water hits the ground or the water surface. As it hits the ground surface, it's removing soil particles, minerals, also taking with it any sort of contamination on the surface from various activities. Enters our surface water, infiltrates into the groundwater, which is then taken up by plants and trees, or through water wells that we dig for drinking water and irrigation purposes. That water evaporates or transpires from plants, reaches the atmosphere again, forms clouds, and begins this whole dynamic cycle all over again. Groundwater is a very important drinking water resource for Americans. If we look at the total volume of Earth's water, 97% of it is tied up in oceans, and only 2.5% is fresh water. And of that 2.5% fresh water, 70% roughly is tied up in glaciers, and 30% is within the ground. So when we think about groundwater, we have what's called aquifers. And basically an aquifer is just essentially storage underground. And it's stored within the geology underground, whatever type of geology that may be. There's something called fractured rock, which this is actually rock, could be limestone, could be granite, could be schist, could be many, many different types of rock. And over time, heat and pressure, it forms cracks or these fractures. And then with precipitation, these fractures fill up. So this serves as a reservoir or the aquifer in this type of geology. In contrast that with a more of a sand or gravel type of aquifer, which stores water between the pores. So the volume, quantity of water available from a well depends upon the geology. So certain types of soils, such as clay, is very tightly bound particles, oftentimes in layers, very little pore space, and therefore would not provide much water. In comparison, that if you have a mixed type of, say, a loam, a sandy clay loam, for example, you do have water storage between the particles. And then in a sandier soil, more coarse grains, you have a lot more water volume, and therefore you would have potentially a higher yielding well. So this diagram shows the different types of aquifers that we run into. And we have here on the land surface what's called the recharge area. This is the area of the watershed where precipitation infiltrates, percolates through the soil, and eventually reaches various types of aquifers. Now we have what's called an unconfined aquifer here. This aquifer here is unconfined, meaning that it is in more direct contact with the surface. Water infiltrates through and then will collect in this unconfined aquifer. A confined aquifer, in contrast, is just that. It is protected, if you will, by an upper confining layer. This could be extremely tight soil, it could be rock, but it basically protects the deeper aquifer from surface waters. Now, albeit water can percolate through confining layers, though it may take thousands of years to do so. It's important to note that groundwater moves. And so here's another diagram which shows the recharge area. Water hits the ground, it infiltrates through. And here's an unconfined aquifer again. And you can see from this drawing that it may be just days, possibly years, months old. Whereas if we go down into deeper aquifers, this water may be centuries and even further down, millennia. So it does show that water does move, it's connected. Groundwater is connected to our streams, certainly connected to our wells, but then water does percolate through these confining beds, albeit very slowly. And then also groundwater does move. So the groundwater quantity and the groundwater quality is based a lot on the geology and the different types of rock and soils, etc. And so in any state, and this is just a diagram of Maryland that shows that there's different types of what's called physiographic provinces, or different subsets, if you will, of geology that will indicate the type and quantity of water that is available. So for example, in the coastal plain area, the eastern shore area of Maryland, we have numerous aquifers that are confined aquifers. We have the shallow aquifers here that could be unconfined, but there's several confined aquifers. And so you can drill down into different types of water quality based on the depth and which aquifer you tap into. It's also important to note that this being a coastal area is that there are, and particularly with sea level rise, more incidents of saline waters getting into the aquifers. In contrast, in the Piedmont region, we have fractured rock geology, whether it be limestone, karst, whatever the case may be, and we have these fractures. Okay, so now the important part about this type of fractured rock geology is some of these fractures are in direct contact with shallow water table, and therefore they're in more direct contact with any sort of surface use contamination. So regardless of the depth of a well, you may still be tapping into fractures that are directly connected to surface waters and surface lands, and therefore are at a greater risk of contamination. It also could be that you tap into with a well into fractures that do not have a connection to the closer surface waters and upper water table. Now, the wells that we drill will vary dependent upon that geology. So on the left here, we have a coastal plain well that shows the well is drilled down into the confined aquifer. And then it's, since this is a sandier, gravelly type of geology, the bottom of the well will have a well screen to protect the well from pumping up any sand particles, etc. But it's within this area is the submersible pump and the well screen, and water is just basically filtering through this gravel pack here at the bottom of the well casing and then enters the well. Whereas in the fractured rock, you have more what's called an open borehole. And you can see these fractures here. So you have, this is open, the pump will be down here, but this open borehole also serves as a reservoir of water. Now, as I said, groundwater can move, and it will move depending upon different types of hydrostatic pressure, as well as the geology and the lay of the land. So the upper graphic here shows a limestone, kind of a karst geology, where there's fractures. You have a home here with a septic tank, and that septic tank effluent is going through this limestone geology, but it's not getting a lot of treatment, and it's following this confining layer, and potentially could contaminate nearby wells. Whereas the bottom graphic shows a more of a coastal plain sandstone type of geology, and the effluent is percolating through the soil, being filtered, eventually will reach groundwater, but then it's already been treated and therefore poses very low, if any, risk to neighboring uses. So again, having the filtration of different types of geology is very important, especially with any sort of wastewater treatment systems. Here's another graphic that just shows that groundwater does move, and the directions can change depending upon the uses that we have. For example, here's a septic tank where the effluent is moving off to the left here. Then there's some development, whether it's a new subdivision, or in this case, it shows a large irrigation well, and you can actually see where now the groundwater is shifted to a different direction because of this large irrigation well. So again, it just shows the dynamics of groundwater movement and then the influence of various types of human activity on that groundwater movement. There's also potential groundwater issues, quality issues. In the case of Maryland here, we have several areas where natural geology provides some contamination. In the case of arsenic, for example, here on the eastern shore, as well as in southern Maryland, but then also over in western Maryland as well. We have radium, we have radon areas, and these are, again, naturally occurring contaminants within the geology. So if you tap into an aquifer in these regions, you may be getting some contamination. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, we do have some brackish water contamination along the coast. Again, regardless of the state you're in, there's information available on these types of things. Usually states will have a geological survey, maybe through their Department of Natural Resources or some similar type of agency. And so this information is out there. Plus the local county environmental health offices will be aware of any sort of naturally occurring contaminants, and you can contact the health department locally and ask about that and get information. So drinking water, our groundwater, our surface water can be contaminated by lots of different types of activities, whether it's industry, agriculture, recreation, automobiles, landfills. Again, all of these activities do contaminate our water supplies. Obviously, over the years, there's been a lot of effort made into properly disposing and storing different types of waste product, different treatment systems. Municipal wastewater treatment plants are being updated, and so therefore we've done a great job in reducing the risk, but still, again, daily activities do influence water, and all of this water is connected. So when we think about a well, a private drinking well or a public drinking water well, there are certain things that are very important to understand and also to check and inspect a well to be sure that it's not having any direct source of contamination. And so basically, there's just a few things there that are important to make sure that the well cap is in good condition and some sanitary well cap. Be sure that the ground is sloping away from the wellhead so that water's not sitting after a rain or a flood sitting right here against the well, because it potentially could infiltrate down along the casing. It's important to have a good grout seal, which is basically special material that's packed in when the well is dug to prevent water from entering and following the casing and then getting down into the aquifer. Here's a picture of a sanitary well cap, a very inexpensive investment to keep out insects, etc. Other things that we can do, of course, is be sure that you're mindful of what you're doing within the location of the well, keeping pets and pet waste away from the well. Pump your septic tank if you're on a septic tank system. Recommended at least every 3 to 5 years, depending upon the size of your tank and the number of people within the home. Other tips is to shift to lower toxicity cleaners. And EPA has a great resource there, the Safer Choice, to give examples of different types of lower toxicity cleaners. Minimize your fertilizer and pesticide use, especially around your well. And consider using some integrated pest management practices to reduce your pesticide use. Be sure that you're storing all chemicals properly. And if you have unused chemicals, be sure to recycle those properly. Do not dump those on the ground or in the water, because they will eventually reach groundwater. If you have any underground storage tanks, be sure that they're in good condition and not leaking. Another tip that you can consider is wash your cars at a commercial facility rather than washing off grease, dirt, asbestos from brake pads in your driveway and letting it run down into the local ditch and streams. Go to a commercial facility where they have some water treatment systems in place to capture that. And then if you have any abandoned wells on your property, be sure that they're sealed properly. That's really critical. Here's an example of an abandoned well. And the diagram on the right shows how these abandoned wells can be contaminated, particularly dug wells. And where there's no casing, water can infiltrate through. Here's an example of a septic tank entering that particular abandoned well. Various sort of activities that you're doing on the ground surface, whatever, could get into that well, and then that well water eventually can contaminate the groundwater. So again, properly sealing a well is really critical. There is techniques out there using specialized soil or specialized concrete mixes to properly seal a well, and that prevents any water from entering the well, the old well, and potentially contaminating groundwater. So some additional practices: if you're on a well, be sure that you get that tested annually for bacteria, coliforms, E. coli, and nitrate. If you have a septic system, be sure that any runoff is routed away from your drain field. Don't drive on your drain field. Don't plant trees near your drain field. You don't want your septic drain field to get clogged and back up, because then it's not working properly. And if it's not working properly, it can contaminate groundwater. Also, just by using our water wisely and using higher energy and efficient appliances and fixtures, we save water. Therefore, we're discharging less water to either our septic system or to our wastewater treatment plant, which again will discharge all that water and eventually it will reach surface or groundwater. Again, conserve water. Fixing leaks is a big opportunity to conserve water, and consider using rain barrels or rain garden in your yard to collect rainwater for irrigation use. And then if you're in the snowy areas of the country, follow good salt use stewardship practices. Sodium chloride is used extensively for salting roads, de-icing roads, and the chloride in salt moves directly into groundwater and negatively impacting aquatic life in streams, but then it goes straight through the soil, eventually gets into groundwater and can elevate the chloride levels. And then it also increases the corrosivity of water, which then can cause some issues potentially of metal leaching, et cetera, from plumbing. So follow that practice will help a lot in reducing the amount of chloride that's entering our groundwater. So in conclusion, here's some resources. Again, depending upon your state Department of Environment, Natural Resources, Geological Survey, those types of agencies that are a wealth of information. Also, EPA has a lot of information on groundwater protection and private drinking wells. And then also check with your local health department, public works office, or your state agency. There are numerous recycling programs around the country and provide you an opportunity to recycle any unused chemicals. So thank you.